happens. I think that's probably fine. Roz, who I don't know, I'm Simeon Bancroft, Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. This is so nice of you to spend your Tuesday evening with us. As people I hope aware, the Historic Districts Council is the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. This is our 50th anniversary year, so we have been celebrating sort of all year with a number of different programs that are highlighting parts of HDC's history. And this is the final program, which is going to be looking at both where we are now and where we hope to be going. We're incredibly pleased to be our moderator for this evening, so you don't have to listen to me stumble over my words, is Tara Kelly. Tara is the Vice President of Programs and Policy for the Municipal Art Society of New York. Previously, she was our colleague as the Executive Director of Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts. She's on the Board of Directors of the Isles of Shoals Association, the Board of Advisors of HDC, as well as the Island Heritage and Artifacts Property Standards Commission of the Star Island Corporation, which is a very, very cool thing, which I will probably ask her about briefly, just because that is a very neat thing that she does. She holds a master's in historic preservation from Pratt Institute and a bachelor's in linguistics from Georgetown University. Tara, thank you so much for joining us. And just so people can know, tell us a little about Isle of Shoals. Shoals. That's always
this
cool.
This isn't about me.
I know, but still.
The Isles of Shoals are 9 small islands off the coast of New Hampshire and Maine. And most people don't know that New Hampshire has islands, but it does in the Atlantic Ocean. And the Star Island is the largest and most populated island there, and has buildings dating to the fishing village era of the 1600s, and then the Victorian era hotel era in the 1800s. And it's a family camp, basically. And so I work to help preserve the buildings there.
I think it's important for us to talk about, sort of broader senses of we're not just the city and people are interested in other stuff. So thank you very much. I am going to turn myself off and leave it to Tara's capable hands.
All right, thank you, Simeon. So as Simeon mentioned, tonight we're going to hear about what HDC has learned over the last 50 years, and on the cusp of a new year, glean some insight into the next 50, we hope. We'll look into our crystal ball. So just to introduce our speakers, starting with Angel. Angel Ayón is a preservation architect with more than 25 years experience with historic buildings. A native of Havana, Cuba, Mr. Ayón holds degrees in architecture and historic preservation from Havana's Higher Polytechnic Institute and Columbia University. He sits on a number of boards and committees of statewide and citywide preservation organizations, and currently serves as VP of Save Harlem Now. Samuel Brooks is the president of the Mott Haven Historic Districts Association, which was one of HDC's 6 to Celebrate neighborhoods. He's also co-chair of the Bronx Landmarks Preservation Committee. Born in Honduras, Mr. Brooks moved to Mott Haven in the 1970s, where he lives in a designated 1889 row house that he has extensively restored, and we can see that beautiful staircase behind him. And he has a background in education and finance, and is an active social leader in the fields of preservation and community development in the Bronx, where his work has been honored by the Bronx Chamber of Commerce. And finally, Vicki Weiner is academic coordinator of the Historic Preservation Master's Degree Program and an adjunct professor at Pratt Institute, which we see behind her. That's Higgins Hall, also my alma mater. A co-founder of the program, she has more than 20 years of experience in the field of preservation and community planning, including roles at the Historic Districts Council, which we're going to hear all the dirt later, and Village Preservation and the Municipal Art Society and the Pratt Center for Community Development. So just to kick off the conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about preservation education and pedagogy in the field, how you come to it, how it's professionally taught, but also the kinds of work that HDC does to educate the community. And just beginning, generally speaking, Vicki, tell us how you came to the field of preservation and how you first encountered HDC.
Thank you, Tara. Thanks, HDC, for having me tonight. I'm delighted to be here, and hello to everybody, friends and old and new. So I came to preservation through an academic experience. I was living in New York and not clear on what I wanted my career path to be, but really loved New York City and was interested in material culture and the built environment and the city's history. And I found my way to applying to a preservation master's degree program at Columbia University. And they, for some reason, took me. I'm not sure why. I have a background in theater arts and creative writing, but they were happy to have me, which was delightful. And I spent 2 years learning about historic preservation, learning about the importance of historic architecture and culture and research methods and all of that good stuff. And from there, I went to, I was doing a job search and I was really interested in neighborhoods. And I encountered first the Village Preservation, then the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. And they were looking for some leadership, and they were looking for someone who knew how to do some fundraising and who had, a master's degree and was interested in public programming. And I ended up being the executive director there. And it was through my work at Village Preservation that I met the folks at HDC and really relied on the leadership of HDC and the board. I was still learning, the art, craft, and science of historic preservation. And I learned so much from being on committees and being on the board of HTC. And then when I was kind of ready to move on from Village Preservation, HTC's executive director position opened up, and I was very privileged to be selected to be the second executive director of HTC after Franny Eberhardt. So, working with communities, I think, is, a real cornerstone of what HTC does. It's the model for working with communities. And, that experience also taught me so much about how important, despite kind of coming from like an academic background and a little, feet off the ground, it's all about what happens in communities. And I think HTC, through its 50 years, has just exemplified the best in engagement and support and technical assistance and hand-holding and championing. And, I think that's, been my experience with HDC.
Thanks, Vicki. Angel, how did you find your passion for preservation, and when did you first meet HTC, and what's it like to be both an architect and an advocate?
Wow, those are all good questions. First, thank you, HTC, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Good to see tons of friends and colleagues on the screen. So, my involvement with preservation really started 25 years ago when I was just leaving School of Architecture. I just graduated from my architectural degree in Havana, and I thought that I had a career path in terms of environmental design and other academic pursuits that for some reason I learned very quickly that wasn't happening. I wasn't joining the faculty and I wasn't pursuing the plans that I thought I had and the opportunities I had. So some of my professors at the time recommended the folks at the National Center for Conservation, Restoration, and Museum Studies in Old Havana to take me under the wings. And I got there and I discovered this whole world. And 6 months later, they were teaching a master's in historic preservation at the same place where I was working on, and this 16th century convent, and I was all fascinated by it. And then I became the project architect for the convent, and one thing just led to another one, and here I am. And how do I get in touch with HDC? I knew about HDC, of course. They're all over the place, sending stuff and putting a good fight always. But I do recall that there was a day that I got a call from Simeon asking me to be involved. And he needed help immediately on this issue with the building. And then he really needed an architect. And somebody told him to call me. And I was like, okay, what do you need? Well, I need an architect. And at that time, I was just taking my exams for my architectural exams. And it was kind of like the same day that I had learned that I had failed an exam. Like, whoa, how terrible. That I had to take it again. So I just remember telling Simeon, okay, fine, you need an architect. I'm not a registered architect yet, but I can help you. I don't know, but I think that the response was a little bit of pudding, and I can't remember exactly what happened after that. But I do know that since then, Simeon has my phone and he calls, and I'm always happy to be involved when they call, and because I can only echo what Vicki says, right? I mean, HTC, the way that I really get to know them is about their involvement, their outreach to the community, and their advocacy, the presence on the street, on the frontiers of preservation, and fighting the good fights. And as I really continue to do preservation advocacy, the work that I got involved in Harlem and citywide, I think HTC has always had a really relevant, remarkable presence that a lot of people depend on. So big players, great people, really great people, associated, talented people, and always willing and able to help and work with the communities.
Sam, you're in a really important community that works closely with the HDC. Tell us what brought you to preservation, and how did you find HDC, or did they find you?
I think it was a combination of both. As Angel and Tara mentioned, I do not have any technical background in historic preservation. However, I've been in the South Bronx in Mott Haven, more specifically since the early 70s. So I've had the privilege of actually seeing the transformation of the South Bronx, in particular in the last 10 years. I got involved in preservation simply by sitting on my stoop in front of my home in Mott Haven East Historic District. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing all these developments taking place in the last 10 years. And then I said to myself, and I got a couple of community folks together, and I said, listen, we need to do something to make sure that our voice can at least preserve not only the architectural gem in the South Bronx, more so in Mott Haven, but also the preservation of culture, music, history, food. And I started the Mott Haven Historic Districts Association in 2016. And I heard of the HDC that they had a program called the Six to Celebrate, which is an incredible program. And I completed an application. I submitted the application, gave the justifiable reasons why. And sure enough, we were fortunate to be chosen in 2017 as one of the Six to Celebrate. And that put Mott Haven on the map in terms of history and preservation. From there, pretty much everything took off. I was in daily contact with HTC. They were giving me a lot of the technical tools that preservationists normally have to their disposal. I attended a couple of their conferences, and before you know it, I was deep into historic preservation and more concerned about the community. And one of the things initially that I wanted to advocate for, it took about 3 years, and that was to get more of the terracotta historic signs throughout Mott Haven. I mean, our first historic district dates back to 1969, just like Greenwich Village. But guess what? We did not have the visibility. No one knew you were walking into, within 3-minute walk, you can walk into 3 different historic districts. And I said, that will be the first challenge. And 3 years later, this past summer, all of a sudden you woke up one morning and you see all these terracotta signs and all of Mott Haven. And it's been obviously with the backing of the Historic District Council. And then we went forward and then we created the Bronx Borough Landmark Committee, which is the most interesting committee because it's a diverse committee of African Americans and Latinos who are now understanding the importance of the historic district. And we pushed and we got the last landmark of the Menida Historic District, which was just approved this past summer in June. So we now have 13 historic districts. The last one was in 2011. So now everyone now on the calls and the meetings that we have with the Bronx Borough Landmark, everyone is now aware. And they sit into all of our Zoom meetings. So it's been an invaluable relationship with HDC.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your stories. So as I mentioned, I think, one of the most important things that HDC does is, educate the general public and communities about this process. about how to get your terracotta signs to show that you're in a historic district. But more broadly speaking, how do we feel that over time, I think maybe Vicki and Angel in particular, with your experience in the field and your own educational experience, what do you think has changed in terms of the indoctrination of young preservationists? And to Sam, I would alter that question a little bit to be about, how do you speak to the community about these issues, and what are the ways that are effective in reaching them?
The way we've been actually doing it's been a grassroots initiative. And what I've done is that I partnered with one of our local tour guide, who is a Bronx native, Alexander Marori, who's been running the Bronx historical tours. So the only way for us to get the activism and promote historic preservation is walking the streets. And we've been doing collectively tours of Mott Haven and the Bronx overall for the last 7 years. Well, she has been doing it, and I have partnered with her for the last 4 years. And the way we define tourism is we don't call them tourists, we call them ambassadors. Because everyone wanted to book a tour in the South Bronx for reasons that they probably read about the 70s and 80s. And when they began the tour on 138th Street in Grand Concourse, they said, but wait a minute, where are the burning buildings? So is that perception, and we do it gently, right? And we tell you're not tourists, you are ambassadors. And when you get back to your foreign countries in Italy and Germany, you're going to tell a compelling story that you have to visit this community because it has transformed itself. So we do it literally 2-3 tours at a time.
I'm gonna unmute Vicki. So, HTC now has preservation school that they offer, but you work at a preservation school. So and you were co-founder of the program at Pratt. So what do you see changing that has changed over time, perhaps since you were studying yourself to now being, facilitating that education for young preservationists?
I think a lot has changed in preservation education, and I think it's been, I think it's sort of been democratized in a lot of ways. I think, early on, preservation education was primarily about architecture. It was primarily, I think, very focused on sort of high style buildings and neighborhoods. And I think that it's really over the past 50 years, we've been seeing this real broadening of the base of historic preservation, and the schools have adapted accordingly. Preservation students today come from a huge variety of backgrounds. They come from, anything from the fine arts and the humanities to architecture. And I think the thing that they all have in common is seeing how historic and cultural resources are like the lifeblood of our cities and our places. And they're really unified by this idea that what we're trying to preserve is, place in total. It's the architecture, but it's also the people who live in the buildings and who provide the cultural character of what you see when you walk through a neighborhood, whether it's through businesses or signage or, art, public art, and just people, enjoying having their own communities and their right to their communities. So I think that the pedagogy has really changed. And, one of the founding principles that Eric Allison and Ned Kaufman, who are really the founders of the Pratt Preservation Program, that they really wanted to make sure was a part of the program was about community engagement, advocacy, being with people where they are, being a supporter, being a technical assistant, not just walking into a neighborhood as a kind of a snooty academic expert of any kind, but really, providing support to communities and learning how to do that. Like, that's a different kind of education than you might find in other professional schools. You're really learning like a body of scholarship and literature about the foundations and the philosophies and then the practices and skills and techniques, but you're also learning how to respect that people are experts in their own neighborhood, and if you want to be helpful to them, you're sharing, you're learning together. It's not an extractive experience, and it's not a, I'm here to tell you what to do experience. It's really a collaborative partnership. So I feel like I have seen from the education I had to what I see colleagues teaching in other programs besides Pratt's program, but particularly at Pratt's program, that's really the foundation that we are building from. It's about community engagement and tapping local knowledge and expertise and learning skills to be helpful to address the issues that communities face with their built fabric, but also with their own, preserving their own ability to stay in their communities. So we really take a very broad approach.
Angel, I think for you, there is definitely a translation that has happened between your academic and professional experience as an architect and preservationist going then into a project like the Fire Watchtower. And so, what kind of dialogue happens in the community there that does exactly the opposite of what Vicki's talking about with the I know that you're not a snooty professional coming in. So what were those conversations like?
Well, I think what I have to say, number one, is that, and I want to refer to HTC in terms of how I see them, that they have changed and evolved over the years, which is also related to the issue of the Fire Watchtower, and my involvement to some extent, is that there has been a sort of like a professional approach to historic preservation and advocacy, right? So you no longer have volunteers who are trying to help people and doing the right thing, right? Now you have a set of professionals trained and educated and experienced in historic preservation policy, advocacy, technical resources, who have the ability to work with communities and not in a top-down, I'm the one who knows, but in a very like, hey, how can we help you? Oh, is that what you need? All right, here's what we can recommend. You can do it this way. Is that what you want to do? Well, here's what you can tell. You can talk to this person, you can call, and so on. So I think that has brought in a tremendous scale and a level of professionalism into the profession that I think does have an impact in the community, in the sense that when those relationships are really well established and when the communication exists and those bridges exist, people do feel that this is the type of organization that they want to have on their hand so that it can support them and so on. And in the case of my experience, I think that's part of what happened, right? So coming from the preservation background and what I knew in Havana, Colombia, and so on, that project really, all of a sudden, the community had been really eager to do something about the watchtower, but didn't know what to do. More importantly, they were depending completely on the Parks Department to call the shots in what needed to be done and why and how. And all of a sudden you have this kid, a 26-year-old kid at that time, that comes in and he says he knows, and he has renders and percentages and talks the talk and can have a conversation with the Parks Department about priorities and issues and so on, fundraising, and at the same time have a different kind of conversation with the community about advocacy. How do we do? What are the fights that we fight? How do we approach it? Who do we talk to? And how do we bring support? What do we need to do? Do we need to like be protesting and putting up a big fight with the Parks Department, or do we need to partner with them, have a meeting, establish priority? How do we bring in the elected officials so that they can support us and really lay out the whole preservation approach and how do you do it, as opposed to telling them this is, we're going to do it ourselves and you watch us do it. Communities do not want to see that, and I think that may have been something that, for me, it's been a fascinating experience. The fact that, again, coming from Havana, Cuba, where you have an authoritarian government that pretty much dictates what needs to be done, the fact that there's something like advocacy, right? So we the people have the right to petition the government. And this is really what advocacy is about. It's really about making sure that there is a fair and good governance, and that the government does what they're supposed to do for the people, what the people wants and needs. And I think the professionalization of preservation helps in the sense that can provide guidance to the community about how to go about that, right? In a way that it could actually really accomplish what they want by being able to working with the government authorities and the various levels and then in the not-for-profit sector and with the public sector and the private sector as well, and trying to figure out how to set up strategies that can really help to accomplish those goals, right? And really, the other important thing is that at the end of the day, that professionalism that is brought into the community by organizations like HTC, and that I think it was also reflected in what happened at the Fire Watchtower, is that eventually it's not about us, about what we do professionally, right? For me, there's always people congratulating me about the Watchtower, and I was like, well, you know, I did part of that. But the real effort became real and robust when there were enough people to do the talk and to walk the walk. And people were repeating the things that I have said for so many years. And people were actually just pretty much taking it on their own. And it became a movement, right? So all of a sudden in Harlem, you have a whole lot of people who were really interested in cast iron, and they knew they could talk about molds and temporary removals and replication and casting and foundries in Alabama. They knew about all these things, and they were really, so it really became a movement. And I think that's the other really important feature of what I see in preservation today and in New York, and that it's unmistakably related to HTC and the work that they do, in the sense that the ultimate goal is just not the organization itself. The ultimate goal is about assisting communities, and communities do find that assistance in entities like HTC as an organization, but also HTC, it's kind of like act sometimes as a key maker and really provides that kind of support. Talk to this person, or you want to write, you're writing a grant to get a designation or to propose a historic district at a state level. Here's a grant maker, so here's someone who can actually do the research once you have the funding. So can really put the resources that the community sometimes just don't need from a professional standpoint at their disposal, and really help them accomplish goals. And of course, everything we also did at in Harlem when we were in the effort of saving the Fire Watchtower, to the most recent efforts on designating a new historic district, through the work that I do through Save Harlem Now, it did have support from HTC, right? That this is the kind of organization that you can call them and say, hey, here's what we're doing, so we need your support. Okay, what do you need? And there you go, right? And their voice has weight. This is the other important thing, right? This is now a competent, professionalized entity. It's just not a whole bunch of volunteers. You have competent, talented, well-prepared people with experience whose voice has weight and is heard. So when they write a letter, it has a lot of meaning. So this is a really compelling story, I think, in terms of the evolution of the organization, I think.
So let's talk about the idea of building the movement. I think that, over time, the tools have changed in preservation, and HTC's methods and tools have changed. And so I'm also curious about what you all think might be forward-looking in terms of the tools that we don't have right now and that we need. So I open this up to any one of you. I'm sure you're clamoring to unmute yourself to talk about what we need going forward and what's changed. I think we still use the buttons. I see Mr. Wood here, fan of the button. But what other ways do we build the movement and gain excitement? Sam talked earlier about recognition through the street signs and through ambassadorship, but how else do we reach people, and what do we need to reach people further?
Well, I'll jump in. I think that, the tools that we use have expanded, which is great. I think that, we're blessed in New York City to have this incredible landmarks law. And, people have become so expert in how to use that law to good, to designate, to regulate. It's not perfect in some eyes, but it's like really powerful. It's a very powerful tool. But I think we're also seeing, I think Angel put his finger on it when he talked about partnership, the partnership that exists between the professionals and the community residents who are not preservation professionals or architects or in the design field, and the civic organizations like HDC. Like it, kind of takes a village to get all of this work done and to kind of cross leverage what each of us can do to move a preservation effort forward and to build the movement. I think one of the things that I've seen that's broadening the base is thinking about like the cultural heritage of communities. And we've for years and years been talking about cultural landmarking and experiencing some frustrations with how do we designate and protect things that are valued for their cultural importance and historical significance that are not necessarily architecturally significant, and debates with the Landmarks Commission. And I would love, of course, to see new tools around different types of designation. I don't know how realistic that is. I think that if it could have gotten done, it probably would have been done by now, maybe. But I feel like we see in other cities the use of conservation districts and other kinds of tools that are policy tools that bring together the different sorts of values of different built environment management, that aren't just about designation of physical fabric, but they're about scale. They might be about use. They combine the best of community planning and preservation policies, but they are sort of more broadly applicable. And I think that's a kind of a great thing. But I think that the kind of outreach to communities that HDC does, and I think the 7 to Save is an amazing tool. Like that is like such an elevator of important ideas about community, and it shines a light on places that are threatened. And it is, I think that was really kind of a brilliant stroke to kind of decide that, we're going to shine a light on places that we need to be paying attention to, and that those places will be different each year, and all the support that goes with that exercise. So, I think that's a fabulous tool. Others will want to jump in.
The Brownsboro Landmarks Committee, I think, is probably one of the most effective tools that I've seen as far as reaching the actual community, because what it does, it actually galvanizes stakeholders who may or may not actually live in a historic district, but what it does, it shows representation of people of the fabric of the community. And one of the byproducts of actually the Brownsboro Landmarks Committee is now that we are so actively watching and looking at the landmarks preservation listing of hearings, something that never happened 6 months ago. I remember 3 months ago or 4 months ago, there was a developer on Alexander Avenue wanted to add an extension to the townhouse. And he thought that nobody in the Bronx would know, and proposed this monstrosity above the roof line that was visible on the street. And when it came up for discussion, he was shocked to see there were actually about 20 of us on that Tuesday call and said, you cannot do this. You need to respect the fabric of the community. You're talking about one of the oldest historic districts, and you want to add a roof extension. So we managed, obviously, to have him reduce it in size and height and move it back appropriately. But it was one of these awakenings to this one developer who owns 7 townhouses in the community, in the historic district. And now he is fully aware that you have to respect the people that are in the community because they're actually aware. And I think one of the most effective tools that caused that change was the creation of the Brownsboro Landmark Committee. And I think we need to extend that to the other boroughs as well and have the same representation, because what it also adds, when you talk about historic preservation, right, you don't talk about minority representation in that same sentence. You don't talk about Afro-Americans, Latinos. It's non-existent. But guess what? we've rapidly changed the numbers overnight as far as attending the conferences, attending preservation school, and now actually talking the talk about preservation and where you live. And all because of this initiative with the Brownsville landmarks. And that has had a significant importance in the diversity of the folks who are now showing up to the annual HTC conferences by default. So that was a very good byproduct.
So it sounds like, sorry, and I keep cutting you off on Hal, so I'm just gonna let you jump in one sec. I was just gonna say that it sounds like there's sort of embedded in there is an old tool, which is, review committee that HTC does and has been doing for decades, but it's about outreach and education to a community to know that they can participate and do the very same thing on their own terms. And so I'm interested to hear, I wonder, Angel, if you have thoughts more about sort of continuing new tools for outreach, new tools for getting the old tools out into communities.
I can talk about that, but I want to mention that what I had in mind when you asked the question was also that, yes, community outreach is important, and that's a lot of what HTC does. But the other really important thing that I think HTC does that I think that they should continue to do, and we need more of that, is just demand good governance, right? So a lot of that is about really just demand that government do what they are supposed to do, and that they do well, and they do it rationally and effectively and consistently. So yeah, for instance, in Harlem, what we see, we have a number of historic of areas that are undeniable historic districts that have no landmarks protection. And even though the commission over the years had, attempted to designate them or to study them and so on. So the bottom line is that they are not being protected. But on the one hand, we work with the commission who understands that there's a need to increase that type of landmarks protection in a place of utmost historical and cultural significance like Harlem, whereas on the other hand, we see what the Department of City Planning did over the year, have done over the year, and continue to do on the mayoral guidance in terms of upzoning, right? So the issue of landmark protections or lack thereof, and zoning, rezoning, and upzoning, it's government doing this in the opposite directions. That's just poor governance. And I think that this is something that the preservation advocate and the preservation profession, now that we're talking about HTC being composed and have access to this variety of competent, talented, educated, and professional folks, I think we can see that, and we can and should be able to do more of that. Just simply demand that we have a system of governance that is just more effective, because this in terms of planning and preservation is just insane. And at the end of the day, this is really what it does, and that it puts communities at the crossroad of this intersection, right? These are the ones the people who suffer, right? When you have a beautiful block that all of a sudden somebody added 2 stories into a brownstone just because there's an Art 7A zoning and it's as of right that there's no landmark, I can add it, and it's really ugly. Everybody hates it on the block, but it's as of right and it's okay. Right? So this is really a lot of what happens. It's just not the development pressures that are created by zoning and so on, but it's a lot of that. It's actually originated in government, in governance, and as a result of poor governance. So I think that there is a lot that can and should be done in that front to make sure that we simplify things and make sure that government as a whole, especially those entities that do have an impact on community and preservation and neighborhood development and striking the right balance between preserving and developing, actually do their work in a way that makes sense and doesn't really affect communities. There are many, and we have way more tools that are coming up online. It's easier to reach out to people, right? Here we are at 7 o'clock talking to people in their living rooms, right? This is new. They're not there. Everybody's wearing their PJs and chancletas at this time while they're having this, right? It's just easier to talk to people through this type of virtual meetings. But at the same time, there's more online mapping tools and online resources that are there that we can tap on and that not only the government, but also the advocates and the community do have access to, that could definitely be put to work, and so on. So, but anyway, I wanted to point to touch base on this issue of just not only making sure that we do well in terms of community outreach, but that we also reach up and demand from the top that we have better governance, that we do the
Yeah,
same.
no, I think that's a great point. And I think it also suggests, what does citizenship look like, now in our current, contemporary world, and how do we help to develop more active citizens and civic participation, particularly among young people who are going to be key. They're the inheritors of, the disaster that's facing us with climate change, and they are, I think, are very engaged in many ways, but to sort of, I think that's a great role that HTC can and should continue to play, and maybe wants to evolve, is tapping young people to better, kind of understand the importance of their communities, and helping them to find the resources to get involved on the community level, and to get involved, in community boards, and to, when we have young people coming through Pratt, we want them to, go to community board meetings, and go to the Landmarks Commission hearings, and, see government at work, and picture yourself being involved, and being, the people who make demands on government, the people who might work for government and make change. I think the other thing that young people feel, that policy is unchangeable, and that you can't write a new law, or you can't change a law, or you can't, you can't come up with new strategies. They when we teach them law and policy, they sometimes get the impression that this is permanent, and this is what we have to work with, and whatever its flaws are, we're sort of stuck living with and living around, and, trying to explain to our students that you could be people who create new and innovative approaches to management of the built world, and from within government or outside it. I think that we all have to work to inspire young people to see themselves as change makers.
I think that that's a great point. I mean, absolutely. We're talking about the future, sort of HTC's 50th anniversary, but on this moment of hinging towards the next 50 years, we hope, of the organization. And so the young people are obviously key to that. And I guess a question that I have for all of you is sort of looking ahead. What do you think the next frontier is for preservation, or for HTC? For Star Trek space, the final frontier. What did they know? What's next for us? What should HTC be turning its lens towards? Going, maybe let's not take the whole next 50, but maybe the next 5. I know what has come up in conversation earlier this evening, and in the call that we had last week, just the panelists, cultural sites was something that was very important. And of course, those of us who've been around for a little bit, and those longer than I, know that this has been a topic of conversation for a very long time, but it seems like maybe there's some movement happening there. What should HTC be up to next?
Well, I hope that, if I may just say something, I hope that 50 years from now, or 10 or 5 or 10, at a certain point, we passed the point of having the silly conversations that we're always having about what is worthy of preservation or not, right? I mean, a lot of what we do know that HTC does is providing the support, the resources that communities need whenever there is a good fight to try to designate a given block, neighborhood, district, and so on, right? Speaking of good governance, I think that in 50 years, hopefully we're not going to be having the conversation about whether that district or those few blocks or 3 blocks are worthy of preservation and designation or not. I hope and I wish, and I think it should be everyone's goal, and hopefully that eventually we designate just as much as it should be designated. And I think this is, I know this is aspirational, but I think it's something that it could also be realistic if it becomes a goal, right? So if we're talking about landmarks protections in the city covering no more than 3% or so of the city. And you know, our colleagues and friends and REBME and other places probably think that that's a lot, but I bet you that you can with all the communities that are for a variety of reasons, cultural reasons, architectural, historical reasons, are worthy of protection and preservation, should be protected and should be designated. And I think that should be everyone's goal. I mean, one of the things that I always find it fascinating every time that HTC comes up with this new group in this little corner of the city that has these too few blocks or these whole districts, and we have a good community there and they want to designate it. It happens every year. I don't know how many times, and maybe have it 2, 3, 4 years. And then we put them in the 7 to celebrate or whatever. To me, if we had to wait to having a community response to be able to demand the government to deliver those protections that takes a lot of time to be implemented, I think that we're losing the soul of the city to some extent, right? I think a good example of good governance would be to, within a finite time frame, be done with this issue of designation. And this is something that, of course, will have to be revisited, right? But I hope that 50 years, if we are trying to revisit this issue of designation, it's not because we're trying to figure out whether that brownstone or that house is significant or not, or because if the cornice was missing or someone lived there or did not live there long enough or so on, that building is worthy of preservation. I think that I would like to think that in 50 years we will be talking about what would be worth preserving of the architecture that we're doing today, right? But not of the architecture that's been in place for 30 years now, or 50 or 100 years. So I think this is an important issue that should be a priority, just to make sure that as a matter of good governance, the government deliver the protections that are guaranteed under the landmarks law to cultural and significant issues. And I think this is something that people can demand and should demand. And I would like to think that in 50 years or less, definitely less, could and should be done. Just being an idealistic, I guess.
I think one of the things that we also came across is that in partnership with the Bronx Historical Tours, that Alex has been doing tours at the elementary school level. So part of their, because of physical activity in schools is no longer. So what she managed to do was actually do a lot of walk-in tours with kids in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, walking them around the neighborhood and pointing to some of the buildings and telling them that this building is over 100 years old. And it's amazing to see the reaction of some of these kids that say, but how is that possible? And I think that goes back to the grassroots of what we're talking about, how we could get HDC into the community and into the schools at a very earlier age. I think that would be a very powerful impact. Create some sort of a high school program or some sort, or elementary school program whereby preservation is something that should be discussed, so that these young men and women, when they make it to high school and even college, preservation is in their blood because they lived it and it was part of their community. I think that will also be a pretty good angle to try to also focus on as part of a broader angle.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, I feel like that is absolutely, something I would love to see happen. For young people to be exposed to historic preservation, both the meaning of place and what we as preservationists bring to, the appreciation and the valuing of our places, and to have young people grasp that, but also to see it as a career path. And to see in any of its, multiple career paths, right? To see that they could become architects that design, that do restoration architecture, that design new appropriate things in historic communities, or that they could be government, they could work in government, or they could be advocates. I think that it'd be great to see a lot more exposure to historic preservation for young people. And I don't think 2nd grade is too early. I think that's terrific. The other thing I kind of wanted to add, and it's really, you know, of course, it's just such an overwhelming topic, is climate change, you know, and how are we as preservationists involved in decision-making around climate adaptation, you know, and mitigation. You know, I think that there's a lot of conversation that I'm hearing, and we hear it at Pratt, and there's several different working groups, and, you know, talking about managed retreat and, you know, historic communities living on the waterfront that are going to be underwater. It's very painful, and we need to figure out how are we going to grapple with that issue. It's both a heritage issue, as communities all around the world are already being disbanded, forced migration. How do they retain their heritage and their culture in light of being forced out of their place? But also in real terms here in New York City, how are we going to support and assist the communities that don't want to have to abandon their place and shouldn't have to? You know, what are the adaptive strategies we can come up with? I mean, I don't have any answers. I just have a lot of questions. But I do think that that's not something, you know, I really would love to see historic preservation in New York and everywhere be really integral to conversations about climate adaptation, because I think our voice is really needed.
And if I can only add to that, that there is another important topic, especially in the moment like we're living in today, where for the last few months, there's been such an important series of discussions at the national level about the pervasive effect of institutional racism in this country. I think that it's still very much needed for the preservation community to make sure that we do take a look at that particular topic and have a robust discussion about it in terms of what does that mean here? What does that mean for us? What does it mean in this context? And to what extent a lot of what's been happening or what has not been happening in terms of providing the protections to cultural heritage in certain parts of the city, it's to some extent the undeniable effect of institutional racism. I think this is an important conversation that we need to have, and I think that it's a painful, difficult conversation, that is one that is extremely important. And here's why: because the communities in the receiving end of that inequality have a very clear understanding of what's been happening for a long time. This is what people have been seeing for a very long time. So on this day and age, when we're having that kind of conversations at the national level and in many professional fields, it's also imperative that the preservation community and in New York, all of us, right, embark in those discussions and have those conversations, because it's the only way that we are going to continue to be effective and really be meaningful and be able to have a legitimate conversation, outreach, and partnership with communities, especially communities of colors that have been complaining for too long that their protections they're not receiving are in their mind without doubt related to this issue of institutional racism. How do we fix that? How do we address that? And how do we, now that we're talking about a set of competent professionals, educated people who do have an understanding of what that means in the context of global and national politics, right? How does that get internalized among ourselves? And how do we create that discussion, figure out what it means and try to tackle it in a positive way that actually can really lead to not only additional protections to places of significance, but also to healing within those communities who've been really felt totally abandoned, and to address who help to address the perception that this issue of landmark protection is something that poor, primarily white neighborhoods and communities do get first and than other places in the city. This is an important conversation. This is a very important topic, and I think that this is the time that is right for those conversations. And I think that we, HTC and any other preservation of advocacy organization will do a better job and will be in a better position to reach out and communicate with those communities as they embark in that type of conversation. It's a tough, difficult conversation. I wouldn't even know where to start, but I think it's one that it's necessary.
So I agree 100%. Like I said, Mott Haven was designated in 1969, the same as Greenwich Village. Manhattan has over, 80 historic districts? The Bronx had 12 up until June 23rd. We just added our 13th. And the only disparity is our zip code. That's the only thing I could see. And exactly to the point. And it's a very interesting topic of conversation. It's being discussed in corporate boardrooms. It's being discussed all over every profession. And preservation also has a place and an important place to play as well, to try to see why neighborhoods such as the South Bronx, with a pretty interesting characteristic, only now has 13 historic districts since 1969.
Yeah, I totally agree that, confronting issues of racism within preservation decision-making and, across the boards is critical. And it's definitely, looping back to the conversation about where preservation pedagogy is in, at Pratt, at Columbia, at Penn, all of our programs, we are really taking a very hard look at this and really hearing from our students how racism is embedded and has been embedded there in subtle forms through the pedagogy, and we're confronting that and seeking to change it and working with diverse groups of alumni, students, and faculty to change how we approach communities and how we think about scholarship and whose scholarship do we assign as readings, right? So we're really looking to become anti-racist programs in whatever way we can. And that's a lot of work, and we're just at the very beginning of that work. And, I think this is an excellent point and super, super important, of course.
It seems like we're just at the beginning of the conversation here, but I think we're almost at the time to end. I had hoped to leave a few minutes for questions, and I just scanned the chat. I didn't see anything there, but I did see that Brad had his hand raised earlier, and I don't know if you still want to ask your question or if we all want to adjourn and ruminate and think about how we're going to go forward and help HTC accomplish these noble and gargantuan goals. But Brad, if you've got your question, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tara. No, I put it in the chat, but it's just a suggestion or a bit of additional food for thought. And it's really taking something that HTC has done a great job with and running with it, which is HTC's borough committees, I do think, have been tremendous in sort of bringing people together who are in all these disparate places. But there are still more disparate historic districts out there beyond the people who will show up at any given borough committee meeting. And one thought on a way to begin to address that issue, to sort of build strength in some of these places that really, maybe it's a small historic district that was created by a very active group of people back in the 60s or the 70s, and they have all petered out functionally, so it is sort of adrift. But that would be to create this role, and I don't know who would do the sort of nominating for this position or the appointing, maybe HTC, but to appoint a curator. And this would be someone who serves as sort of the focal point of contact for a bunch of the different small sort of orphaned historic districts out there that do not have a friends group or other association. That person, by being named a curator, really is more about being able to tell the story or sort of be the focal person for that district without implying a heavy lift of duty, but just finding someone to be a sort of living spirit that can be contacted regarding that district would be a huge beginning, and is probably a more difficult task than I'm making it out to be. But I wanted to throw that idea out there.
Brad, it sounds actually like a project for the New York Preservation Archive project.
Hopefully there's a funding foundation on this Zoom call.
I think he had a hard stop. Okay, well, I think that it's probably time so that we can all get along with our evenings. And again, think about ways we can contribute to this new mandate for HTC. Maybe also help Brad execute his own idea. Simeon, did you want to close us out for the evening?
I just wanted to thank everybody. Thank you so much, Tara, for doing a great job. And Hal, Sam, Vicki, thank you so much for the time, the conversation. A lot of very interesting things were brought up, and I really appreciate it. So thanks, everybody, and happy holidays.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Same to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Okay.